Good morning, welcome back to the garden. So yesterday I picked up a few of these $30 raised beds off of Amazon to add a little pizzazz to our container garden. And I did a little bit of quick math on how much it would cost to fill these up. Filling them with just middle of the road raised bed mix or potting soil would cost about $90 each. Yeah, we're not gonna do that. Instead, I'm gonna show you how to fill these up in two different ways without breaking the bank. And the first way we're gonna do it is actually gonna break not one, but two immutable laws of container gardening. Should be fun, let's get into it. This guy decided he wanted to help today. Hi. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do is actually add some of the old potting mix from some of the containers that were displaced by adding these raised beds into our mix. There's this weird myth out there that you can't reuse potting soil. Completely untrue. Basically, this stuff is gonna lose some of its structural properties that make it really good for growing in a pot over time. It's easy to fix even if you wanna reuse it in a pot, but it actually makes it great for a raised bed garden where we don't need it to be quite so fluffy, where we don't need it to have such good drainage. You might be surprised if you have old pots lying around how far that stuff will go. All right, now let's go ahead and mix up the rest of the dirt we're gonna need for this container according to the recipe right here. As you can tell from this recipe, you are gonna need some materials from your garden, things like wood chips, preferably from a local arborist, and things like topsoil from the dirt around your yard. If that's not feasible for you, totally understand, don't worry about it. The next version we're gonna do this, the next recipe doesn't require those things, and I'll put a timestamp down below so you can just jump right to that section. Let's get going. All right, the first thing we're gonna do is fill this wheelbarrow up 30% full of dirt from my garden. You'll notice there's a ton of old dead plant matter in there. Doesn't bother me much. It's from an area of the garden that's just gone fallow. If you are working with an area that's got a lot of noxious weeds, you may wanna be a little bit more careful that you're removing all of that material and that you're not getting anything in there that may pop up into your raised bed garden. Now, you probably also heard that what I just did is totally taboo. Never add your native garden soil to your container mixes, right? I think the reality is that people around the world do this all the time to save money, including myself, and it's always actually worked out pretty well in our garden so long as it's not making up the bulk of that container mix. Also, keep in mind that the plants that I grow in these containers, they're gonna have to make contact with the soil at some point or another. These are open bottom containers. Good, bad, neutral, doesn't matter. They're gonna have to deal with whatever is in my dirt one way or another. Next up, we wanna add about 40% compost or aged manure. But if you are using aged manure, I highly recommend chicken manure because it's going to be higher in nitrogen, and this mix is gonna need that extra nitrogen. Compost. All right, this mix feels pretty good. It's not too heavy. I think I could grow in it as is, but it would be even better with something to add a little bit of structure and something to add a little bit of drainage. Now, typically I would be adding sphagnum peat moss or perlite to serve those purposes, but since we're trying to save money, those aren't gonna work. Those aren't really very cheap ingredients. So instead, we're gonna go a little bit rogue and we're gonna use wood chips. Let's take a quick time out to talk about wood chips as a soil ingredient because they're pretty controversial. That's an understatement. They're avoided like the plague by a lot of folks. But the reality is using wood chips in soil is probably not quite as uncommon as you might imagine because they're just about the cheapest way to add the structure that you get from something like sphagnum peat moss or coco coir and some additional drainage and some additional aeration. They're basically free, right? It's hard to beat that. So why then are they controversial? Well, wood chips in the soil can change that soil chemistry in some really meaningful ways. First off, they can change the pH. They can lower that pH, make it more acidic, but not always in very predictable ways. And having all of that heavy carbon material in that soil is actually going to change the balance. It's going to change the ecosystem of microorganism species that live in that soil. Again, not always in predictable or helpful ways. And most importantly, as the bacteria in that soil attempt to break down all of the carbon in those wood chips, they're gonna bind up the available nitrogen in the soil. Now, importantly there, you'll notice that I said bind up. They don't suck up, they don't use, they bind that nitrogen temporarily as they break down the carbon. Consequently, those plants are gonna have less nitrogen available for proper growth. Full stop, those things are real, those things are problematic, and if you are growing produce for sale, probably not worth it. But as a home gardener, I have personally found that the downsides of using wood chips in my soil probably a little bit overblown, and at least to some degree, we can counteract those downsides by using extra nitrogen sources, things like extra compost and extra fertilizer. And much more important than my personal anecdotal experience, there is actually some real scientific research on the concept of using wood chips to replace things like peat moss and perlite. At least one study, and I'll link both of these down in the description, but at least one study found that even in a professional setting, it worked pretty well, about the same. Another study found it worked very well for soybeans, but totally stunted their cucumber and sunflower plant. Again, I'll link those down below, probably worth taking a look if you want to try this yourself at home. Always helps to know what you're getting yourself into, right? Let's get back to that raised bed. All right, I'm all done mixing this up, and the consistency is actually pretty good. It's exactly where I want it to be. It does not look like a beautiful bag of potting soil from the store, but somehow I don't think our plants are gonna care that much what it looks like. The last thing we need to do is add a whole bunch of fertilizer. I'm actually going to be using 3 full cups of this organic granular fertilizer just into the mix, and then we're gonna be adding another cup to top the whole thing off once it's actually in the raised bed. It's a lot of fertilizer, but as I mentioned, this mix needs a lot of fertilizer. Let's get to it. Hey there, quick interruption. If you're finding this video helpful and you think it's gonna help you fill up those raised beds without going bankrupt, would you mind hitting that like button for me, the thumbs up somewhere down there? Yeah, it truly makes all the difference for me, and I really appreciate your help. Thank you so much for supporting this video and for supporting the channel. Let's get back to those raised beds. All right, now that our bed is full of soil, there are 3 more things I want to do to make it absolutely perfect. First off, I'm gonna scratch about a cup of fertilizer right into this top layer, the top 1 to 2 inches. And that's just gonna make sure that those seedlings have all the fertilizer they need right available at that top layer of soil. Second thing I'm gonna do is actually scoop these compost worms right into the middle of this bed, just to jumpstart the population of worms in this bed and make sure we're breaking down all of that good organic material that we know is in there. Third off, we need to get planting. Now you can totally plant just about anything you want into this mix, and it's gonna do pretty well. Maybe not amazingly, but it's gonna do pretty well. But if you have the patience for it, you're gonna be even better off if you can do a round of cover crops. So I've got a bag here of hairy vetch and winter rye and field peas, and we're gonna plant them here, and we're gonna take a full season to let those grow in. And then at the end of the season, before they start flowering, we're gonna terminate them, we're gonna cut them down, and we're gonna mix all that green material right back into this soil.
By the way, this is what the soil is gonna look like in about a year. We did the exact same thing in this bed. Manure, compost, wood chips, native soil from an area of the garden that we cleared of weeds, some dead weed matter, and that's it. And it's actually been growing really well for us over the past year. We did this a year ago. In that time, we grew cover crops, we grew bush beans, we grew zinnias, we grew basil, we grew lettuce. And at this point, soil is actually pretty good. You can see there's still some wood chips in there that haven't fully broken down, but 90% of that carbony material is gone. And this thing is also loaded with worms. Pretty good soil, and we paid a couple bucks for it.
By the way, quick note on planting cover crops. Make sure you plan out how you're going to get rid of those cover crops before you plant them. If you don't have a plan on how to terminate your cover crops, you're kind of just planting weeds. When I first got started with raised bed gardening, I spent all of my budget for the project on cedar planks. And then when it came time to fill them up, I had no budget left for soil. So I went to the store and I bought the absolute cheapest bags of a raised bed mix and topsoil I could find. And I filled them up about 2/3, 3/4 full of that stuff. And then I just added a bag or 2 of some decent potting mix there on top. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I just wanted to start growing. Miraculously, it worked really well. I had a beautiful harvest, tons of food. We grew beautiful tomatoes that way, actually. And the reason for that is plant roots are actually very concentrated at the top layers of the soil. That's where they get most of their nutrients from. So today we're gonna take advantage of that little fact by layering on a good mix on top of a cheap mix to fill up the second raised bed. And here's the recipe we're gonna follow to do it. All right, so this is just beyond simple. All we're gonna do first is just fill this up to start, about 2/3 full of this garden soil, bagged garden soil. This is much cheaper than a good bag of potting mix. All right, mixed up, simple as can be. We're gonna fill up these last 3 or 4 inches with just a bagged potting soil. I'm using Pro Mix. I like this stuff, nothing special, but it's a good quality to price ratio, so that's what we're gonna go with today. Let's get it in there. All right, with our bed all full up, we're gonna do 2 things the same as last time and 1 thing different. I am gonna start by adding about a cup of fertilizer right into this top layer for the same reason. Gotta make sure those seedlings have plenty of nutrients in that top layer of soil. I'm also gonna add a nice scoop of compost worms in here, not because there's a ton of organic material for them to break down, but just because I generally think worms are a good thing. You can probably skip that step if you want with this mix. Third, we're gonna be doing something a little bit different. You might notice here that I've left a little bit of space between the soil line and the top of the raised bed. And that's because I'm gonna be adding a nice big layer of wood chip mulch. I can do that this time because we're not going to be direct seeding cover crops. I'm actually going to be planting in our food crops directly right now. You could totally do a round of cover crops in this if you want to, but probably not necessary. So let's get that fertilizer in there, those worms in there, a nice layer of wood chip, and then plant in a couple cucumbers. And we are done. Both beds are full of dirt, fertilized, got plenty of worms, mulched up, and are planted in. Now all we have to do is make sure they stay well watered, got some irrigation line, and then enjoy the fruits of our labor. I hope this was helpful, y'all, and until next time, happy gardening.